Gaining experience is very important, but it's even more important to learn from our experiences and to react well to our experiences. This is seen in the book George Washington, The Forge of Experience, 1732 to 1775. This is a biography written by James Thomas Flexner in the 1960s. It's actually the first book in a series of 4 from Flexner on George Washington's life. It's a very interesting book, and I want to cover some of the important parts, and I hope you'll give the book a read. So here's the outline to this review, what the book is about, how the story is told, accuracy, and then why read the book. So what the book is about, I want to quote from Flexner's introduction. It's a very interesting introduction. Flexner writes, "To really love and appreciate one's father, it is necessary to disclose, by banishing the delusions of infantile thinking, the man he really is and was. In this volume, we shall seek the actual man who was the father of his country." So Flexner endeavors in this book to show who Washington really was, to show what he was really like. How the story is told. Again, I want to quote from the introduction of the book. Flexner writes this: "This volume presents the experiences from which George Washington learned and tries to show by his actions and his written thoughts how he reacted at each stage of his long apprenticeship up to the moment when, formed by the years into a great leader, the American hero unsheathed the revolutionary sword." I just love that last line. So Flexner tells us how he tells this story. He focuses on the experiences of George Washington. Now, these experiences are primarily the early life experiences of George Washington up until the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So Flexner's next book focuses on the Revolutionary War itself. So Flexner not only talks about the experiences of George Washington, he wants to show how Washington reacted to these experiences. And as you can see here, he does this through Washington's actions and his written thoughts. So a lot was written by George Washington. George Washington documented his experiences. He wrote in journals, he wrote letters to people, they wrote back to him. There were many people who knew George Washington who wrote about him and his experiences. So there is a huge record of original documents about George Washington and his experiences and how he reacted. Okay, so some of the experiences that you'll read about in this book are his upbringing on Ferry Farm, Virginia. The Fairfax family, this was a very influential family in Virginia that George Washington knew. There is a county in Virginia called Fairfax County named after this family. His surveying work, his brother's illness and death, his wilderness journey across Ohio, the 7 Years' War, he played a big part in this war. His Virginia Army Command protecting frontier families in the Shenandoah Valley, and his domestic life on Mount Vernon, and finally the Continental Congresses at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So these experiences are explained throughout the book. In Chapter 1, Birth of a Hero, you'll learn about George Washington's early life. He was born on February 11, 1732 in Virginia to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. Now, very sadly, George Washington's father, Augustine, died when George was only 11 years old. The book goes into more detail about his mother, Mary Ball Washington. She lived a very long time up through, or at least part of George Washington's second term as President of the United States. So he was raised on Ferry Farm near the Rappahannock River. You can see a picture of his house and the river. And he received a practical education, including arithmetic. Now, his math training proved very important for his work as a surveyor as a teenager. So I want to skip to Chapter 4, Surveyor's Wages. At the age of 16, George became a surveyor for the Fairfax family. This was a government position of trust. Now, he measured and divided land in the Shenandoah Valley frontier for rent and farming. Now, this was a position of trust because, number one, he was supporting the government. It needed to be done accurately according to the rules and the laws. But also, he was an agent of the Fairfax family. The land in the Shenandoah Valley that he was surveying was their property. So it was kind of a conflict of interest, and Flexner states that it required a statesman, someone who was honest. Okay, Chapter 6, Forest Adventure. This is one of my favorite chapters in the book. I've read it twice. At 21, Washington, now an Army major, was commanded to deliver a message to the French to depart from the Ohio River Territory. So what's going on here? Well, in the mid-1700s, there was a lot of competition between England and France. It spilled over into the French and Indian War on the American continent. So there was competition between these nations for land and trade and resources. So Washington was ordered by the English to deliver a message to the French to get off what the English believed to be was their land. So with several men, Washington journeyed to Fort Le Boeuf near Lake Erie. You can see a picture of the fort, and you can see a picture that George Washington drew of his route, a map. You can see the Potomac River, and you can see how he crossed the Allegheny Mountains into the wilderness. This is not just frontier, this is wilderness back when Washington was doing this. And you can see how he passed the fork of the Ohio River, and he traveled all the way up to Fort Le Boeuf south of Lake Erie. So that's a long way. That's a long travel. And it was a very dangerous journey, especially on the way back. He traveled across snow and ice. I'm not going to spill all the beans. I want you to read the story. It's very interesting, and it took someone who was very brave. Okay, so chapter 10, Nightmare, another really interesting chapter. This is in the French and Indian War. At 23 years of age, Washington supported General Edward Braddock's expedition to Fort Duquesne. So you can see a map of this expedition. Washington was helping to lead an army of men. And so they started in Alexandria, Virginia. They went across the Shenandoah Mountains, across the Shenandoah Valley through Winchester, which was a small town at that time, all the way across the Allegheny Mountains, and all the way up close to Fort Duquesne. But they didn't quite get there because they were ambushed and they were forced to retreat. And this turned into a very bloody, violent battle. You had English troops panicking, running away. Washington and the officers did their best to stand their ground. Washington was very brave. Many of the officers died. Braddock was shot. And Washington fought bravely, even though he was quite ill. And he was ordered by Braddock to ride 40 miles to get help. So he rode in the dark. It was a very, I'm sure, scary and terrifying journey. But what's very interesting is that Washington felt the miraculous care of Providence. He stated this. So Providence was his favorite term for God. And so he felt that he was protected by God. And I don't want to spill the beans. I want you to read the story for yourself and to see what happened in this battle. But very interesting chapter. Okay, I want to fast forward to the end of the book, chapter 19, A Dreadful Trust. This is at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. This is 20 years after the story I just told about his Braddock expedition. This is in 1775. The Continental Congress asked Washington to command the Continental Army. Now, one of the very interesting things about this story is that Washington was reluctant to accept this command. He did not feel he had the capacity to do this. He wanted someone else to, but he also knew it was his duty. So he accepted. And in the book, you can read his acceptance speech to the Continental Congress. Very interesting speech. And after he wrote his wife Martha, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it from a consciousness of its being too great for my capacity. But it has been a kind of destiny that has thrown me upon this service. I shall hope that my undertaking it is designed to answer some good purpose. So very interesting. He believed it was beyond his capacity, but he also believed he needed to lead, and he turned out to be the man for the job. Okay. So I want to touch on the accuracy of this book. Is it accurate or not? Well, I think there's a lot going for this book by Flexner. Number one, Flexner focused on the original documents, including George Washington's writings. In Appendix C of the book, very interesting, he talks about how he wrote the book. He talks about his research, what he researched. He said that he mastered the original documents, and there are thousands and thousands of original documents. Again, correspondence, letters, things written about Washington, Washington's journal. So he mastered these documents. Then he wrote the first draft. And at that point, after he wrote the first draft, based on the original documents, he consulted secondary sources, which were other biographies. So that is a very good sign. He was focusing on the original documents, what they had to say about Washington. Well, number two, in the Appendix C, you can see that he was able to distinguish between helpful and unhelpful biographies or secondary sources. So it's a great resource if you want to read more about George Washington. Flexner talks about which biographies are factual and helpful and which biographies are not as factual. So he spent a lot of time thinking about this based upon his research in the original sources. And then notes on Washington's strengths and faults. So Flexner takes the time to not only point out Washington's strengths, but also his faults. So you get a well-rounded, accurate picture of George Washington's life. Again, his strengths and his faults. Okay, why read the book? Well, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think there are a few benefits to reading this book. Number one, if you read this book, you'll be able to think about Washington's character and his personality. He was very warm, the record shows. People really liked him. He was a people person. He was humble, I think, especially as he aged. And he was very self-aware. He was always trying to improve himself. He would reflect later in life, in his middle years, about his experiences and how he reacted. And he tried to improve himself. And it seems that he did. If you read the book, you'll be able to think about how Washington handled difficult and dangerous experiences. These are all throughout the book, and I think that's very helpful. And then finally, you'll gain a vision of greatness, and you'll see Washington's greatness in Braddock's expedition, in the French and Indian War. You'll see this when he was commanding later on the Virginia Regiment in the Shenandoah Valley. He was protecting frontier families in the Shenandoah Valley from Indian attacks. This was one of the toughest moments of his life, or times of his life. So how he reacted, how he led in very difficult circumstances here, that's very helpful. And you also see his great hospitality. He was very hospitable with his wife Martha at Mount Vernon, and he was very generous. He helped a lot of people that needed some financial support. And he also was a very humble person, it seems, not grasping for power when he was asked to lead the Continental Army. So, again, another example of his greatness. So, a lot of thoughts here, a lot of things that can benefit you in terms of reading this book. Well, I want to end with a final thought, and I want to give Flexner the final word. He said, "I tried to start my study as if I had never before heard the name Washington. I did not even assume that he had been good and great. My labors have persuaded me that he became one of the noblest and greatest men who ever lived. But he was not born that way. He did not spring from the head of Jove." Jove is considered to be by the Romans a god. He was a pagan god. "Already armored with wisdom and strength. He perfected himself gradually through the exercise of his own will and skill." Okay, so very interesting quote. So Flexner starts his research trying to have an open mind, trying to let the source documentation help him understand if Washington was great or not. And he came to the conclusion that Washington truly was a great person. But very interesting, Flexner states that he was not born great. He worked on himself over time. He, as Flexner states, perfected himself through his will and skill. So that provides a lot of hope for you and me, that even Washington did not start out great. He worked very hard, and he was very reflective and tried to improve himself over time. Okay, well, I hope you will give the book a read. The book was written for adults, but if you are a high school student, I think you can handle the book. You might have to get out a dictionary to look up a few words. I had to look up a few words to see what they mean. If you are a bright, intelligent middle school student, I think you can also handle the book. So let me know what you think about it. I will talk to you next time. Thank you.